G'day and welcome back to another episode of Painting Oathsworn. In this episode we are going to be looking at painting metallic surfaces, be they weapons, armour, buckles or whatever the case may be. And for that we've chosen the penitent, who is of course covered in armour from head to toe. Now there's a variety of different ways you can approach painting metal. One of them is a very clean looking finish. The other way you can approach painting metal is a rusted and weather-beaten look. It's usually my preference to go with the second, firstly because it's easier to achieve a great looking finish, and secondly because it does tie into the theme and story of this world, given that it is a very dark and depressing place. Now for the overlay colour I've chosen a red, and it's important to understand that this is for two reasons. One, because I wanted to make the cloak red, but two, because I want this base colour to be representative of some rust and some aging on the metal. So we're going to leave some of that red showing as we progress. Speaking of, let's get started. So as we dive into mixing this first colour, I want to talk about two key things that we're going to cover in this episode. The first is the contrast that we need to create when painting with a metallic pigment. And then the second is the approach that non-metallic metal painters use. Now, non-metallic metal is a technique where you replicate a metallic surface with a flat, normal pigment, whereas true metallic metals is painting with these metallic paints that have the metallic flakes and pigments in them. So the first element is contrast. Now you can see here I'm leaving elements of this red undercoat showing through this base colour. The base colour that I've mixed is a Vallejo colour called bronze, and I've also mixed in a little black into that colour. So the whole intent of this armour for the penitent is to create a rusted, worn, textured, weather-beaten looking metal. And in a future episode, which will be focused on painting gold, we will talk about how to paint something that is a little more smooth and polished. But here, what I'm trying to do is really create an interesting texture and shade to this metal. So the red color that you're seeing on the base tone has the effect of creating a rusted undertone and nuance to this armor. But the second component of what it's doing is it is a very flat and matte surface that is going to contrast with the shiny and shimmering pigment of the metallic paints. So in previous episodes I have talked about how contrast can be created in a lot of ways. We've talked about warm and cold contrast, we've talked about value contrast, and here what we're looking at is the contrast between a shiny surface and a matte surface. In essence, when painting with true metallics, when painting with paints that have metallic pigments in them, I believe the way to create the most interest and to create a good looking metal object is to have a flat and matte color as your shadow and your metallic pigments be your highlights to create that additional layer of contrast. So the reason I've chosen this bronze color, it's a color that reminds me of a Games Workshop color a few years ago that I first started painting with, that still to this day is one of my favorite paints. It's called Tin Bits, and Tin Bits was a really rich, warm, darker sort of metal color. And I always found that when I painted something metallic with tin bits as the base, that the metal just looked more interesting and rich. And so I try to replicate that here with this particular bronze color, just to help the metal feel a little bit more alive, a little bit more in keeping with the environment and the environmental colors. So these figures are obviously going to be used in the middle of a table in a game. There's every chance that they may get hit with dice or knocked over or bumped, and we'll obviously be manipulating them when we're moving weapons in and out of the arms. And so for me, a key part of this process is ensuring that I'm going to varnish the figures to protect them. So the type of varnish that I use is a can varnish, and it creates a very matte finish. Now here I'm mixing up our actual steel color, and this color is called Black Metal from scale 75. Now I really like black metal as a color for my metallic surfaces because of the exact same reason I just talked about before with the contrast between matte and shiny. I find this particular color to dry just a little on the matte side. You still have that glistening pigment look, but it is a little bit more matte than, say, some of the other colors that we'll use later on in the process. So by building up the stages of color with a color that is slightly more matte, it really reinforces the impact of those final stages of highlights and glistening colors that we use in the last steps. So the second component of what I wanted to talk about in this episode is related to non-metallic metal. So non-metallic metals are a technique that's been around for many, many, many years, not just in miniature painting, but in painting of artworks for thousands of years. And it's the effect of replicating metal with just normal opaque paints. That process has a pretty clear and defined way of placing your highlights and your shadows to replicate that effect. And in some cases, when you're using a metallic pigment, it's easy to think that you don't need to worry about those same concepts that you would with non-metallic metal, and simply just highlight as you normally would, allowing the reflective pigments to do all of your work. I think it really helps, again, to create contrast, to create visual interest, to ensure that you are really thinking about the placement of your highlights consistent with that non-metallic metal methodology, and it will really help your metals look a little bit more alive and accurate. So I won't get into it too much in this series, non-metallic metal, but in some cases you'll see the placement of my lights is intentional around reinforcing that metallic type effect. So as I said at the start, I really want this to be a weather-beaten and worn-down look, and so I'm choosing to add a lot of layers of texturing here. So this particular layer is a rust layer, and I'm using a light orange there from AK, and you can see that I'm stippling that on with a really old brush that has a lot of bristle all over the place, and I'm really being quite uncaring with how I place these layers, because I've watered down this color pretty significantly. So it's going to run into the recesses, into the cracks, and just add another layer of texture into this armor. You probably don't need to undergo all of the steps that I've undergone for this particular armor on all of your metal, but with this penitent figure who looks to me like the type of chap who's not really going to pay much attention to the quality of his equipment, I really want to reinforce that weather-beaten look. So here we're going to add some contrast paint, which is again a rusty dark brown color, to try and continue to add that extra layer of depth in the shadows and really reinforce how rusted and worn down this metal is. Now, as I said at the start, I want to create a contrast between the metallic pigments and the shadows and the rest of the areas which are non-metallics. They're just normal flat matte colors. So the next step after this layer of contrast paint dries is to actually varnish the whole piece. and that will create a matte and consistent finish, which we will then place our metallic pigments over the top of. So it's all about, as I said, the layer of contrast between shiny and matte, and we're using both these colors here, the rust and this contrast paint, in addition to that varnish, to create a really clear separation between those two things. There's a lot of ways to approach metallic paints. This is the way that I approach it because I feel like it gives you a more interesting look and a more impactful look on the table. But you don't need to go to this level of detail on every element. You'll see I don't go to this level of detail on other weapons or things on other models. So here we're going to mix into the black metal a little bit of the Vallejo Model Air Steel. Now I find the best metallic paints, the most intense metallic paints, are a Model Air range, and I find them to just be very, very heavily pigmented, but also dilute and easy to work with. So you can see I'm building up lots of little layers of texture, little micro scratches, all of these tiny little elements which I will eventually continue to build up over the top of. But you can begin to see, and the black metal is still the predominant color here, so it's still quite a matte surface, not reflective at all. As we're building up these layers of metallic highlights, you'll start to see the intensity of the pigment, the intensity of the reflections continue to increase until we get to our final highlight, which is the pure metallic pigment, the pure steel. And I feel like all of the underlying colors, all the underlying bits that you can see through there, you can see the orange, you can see the red, you can see that contrast paint, has helped to create a much more interesting and vibrant looking metal. One thing I do find is necessary to do in this type of approach is, once you've built up your layers of highlights, is sometimes it's good to go back in and reinforce the separation of elements, particularly with the contrast paint, particularly with areas like the helmet. You want to really ensure that there's a clear separation between each of those separate elements, just by doing a black line in between each of those things, and you can see it helps to create a clear sense of separation. So as we're building up these layers of highlights, you'll see that I'm starting to focus my highlights in specific areas, and again this ties into that approach that I talked about with non-metallic metal concepts. So if you focus your highlights just the way that you normally would, it'll certainly look absolutely fine. But thinking about how metal reflects light differently, and then feeding into that with your approach, will really help to create a much more interesting looking metal as you rotate it around and move it around on the table. As always, the key in miniature painting is creating contrast so that you have a visually interesting figure to look at. The bristle that is sticking out on this brush is annoying me tremendously. So I'm just going to focus a little bit of attention here on this shield. As you can see, the shield itself really has a lot of those underlying colors and textures, which looks super interesting. As we build up the metallic pigments, you'll see that I'm concentrating these highlights on the edges of objects, and also a little bit more on sections where the light is going to catch, whether that's scratches or whether that's a specific sort of area on the figure. I think metallic painting, it's easy to get a little bit lost in the fact that the pigment tends to look really cool when you glisten it, when it's glistening and moving around. It's easy to think that that's all you need to do, but really spending a little bit more time to add some nuance, some contrast between that shiny effect and the matte finish will really pay off on the table. The interesting thing about weathered textures on metal is there is no rules for brush strokes, for the direction of strokes, the length, the size, the width. You can be really free and just allow the brush to pretty much do all the hard work for you. So here we're going to do a final highlight with the steel, and you can see that this is really having a huge impact on how much brighter this final highlight is. And you can see I'm much more considered with my placement of highlights, really focused on specific areas. This is such an important step, and it's probably the most important step in painting metallic paints. And there's that bristle again. Just getting those really highest highlights, the reflective lights, in the right spots, allowing your model to really glisten as you spin it around. It's really hard to get this type of paint to look good on camera. Getting the exposure right will sometimes make the rest of the figure look dark because the light is simply reflecting off this and almost looking like pure white. But we know it's that steel color. So again, you can see on that shield where I've really focused the highlights towards the top section of the shield. And again, that is thinking about non-metallic metal, how the light would interact with our zenithal prime, and placing the highlights in consideration with that. This steel color is just an absolute banger. It's so strong and so easy to work with because it is a model air color. You really see how smoothly it flows off the brush. I think sometimes other metallic paints, they can tend to be a little on the thicker side because that pigment does tend to clump up a little, the metallic flakes. So the steel from Model Air is really vibrant and really intense, but also really dilute, which gives you a lot more control as long as you're remembering to wipe off your brush on a paper towel before you move to the figure. So again, just concentrating on those edges, looking at each of these little elements and where we're going to see the light reflecting from. We're not trying to place this on every single surface in every area. We just really want to concentrate on those elements where we're going to have the most reflection and the most impact. And really trying to leave elements on that figure that aren't covered in a metallic paint. Leaving those matte surfaces really to create that extra level of contrast. So you can see I switched to a really small brush here, just adding some little final scratches all across the figure. This is a really easy, fun process. I think you really get to think about little things like who's this guy been fighting and what sort of weapons have been hitting him, and maybe he's been dealing with lots of sword battles, or maybe he's had arrows shot at him, little spots, little scrapes, all that type of thing. It can be super fun. This last step is what transforms your metal into an object that looks finished. Pretty much every layer prior to this one is all about selling the illusion of this last layer. I've seen other people approach metallic paints in reverse to this process, which is starting with a metallic paint and then shading down from there. And we will actually talk about that approach with the blade when we go through the gold discussion, which is coming up pretty soon. But the key difference with this approach is you're really in much more control of the highlights. You're really able to place those lights in the most important spots and really get a vibrant and intense finish. So normally this would probably be about where I'd leave the armor, but in this instance I did want to create some clear weathering, more so than I've already done with these light layers of color. And so we're going to do that with a ink. Now, you may wonder why I've switched to this scale ink as opposed to the contrast paints that I've been using a lot. Well, the inks are simply the pure transparent pigment, whereas the contrast paints also include a little bit of a medium to help them flow and finish the way that they do. The inks I find are better for this type of work, which is where you're looking to create pretty thin lines representing sort of water stains or water effects, and also find that you can mix them a tiny little bit with some paint and you'll get a much more consistent and controllable paint to work with. So the second thing with the inks is they do create a little bit more of a shiny finish, and again I'm trying to lean into the contrast between texture and smooth and the contrast between shiny and matte. And so these two things are constantly working and constantly creating a more interesting looking figure. I also find the intensity colors to be really vibrant as well. Any ink will work, any chestnut ink, even a contrast paint, as I said, it's a very similar stuff. You may just have to work a little bit harder to get it to be as dilute as you want it to be to draw thin lines. So these little layers of ink are being placed in all of the areas where rust would gather, thinking about how water may run down the object, and I'm varying the mixture, adding in some black, adding in more of the intensity, and really just trying to add more life and more interest to this whole piece. This is one of my favourite figures that I painted in this series, and I know Jamie felt this was his favourite. And I think the great thing about this figure is we did it in a pretty short time. I think this one was just under 2 hours, and that's because the majority of it is this metal surface, which means we just get to spend the majority of our workflow going through and doing all of these colors and these shades, which is great. So this is a really easy and straightforward process to create a fun and dynamic looking medal. It's certainly weather beaten. It's certainly in keeping with my ethos of having the environment play a factor in the figure painting, but I do think it's super achievable. The key is constantly referring back to that matte versus reflective approach and considering how the paint would be placed from a non-metallic metal perspective. But yeah, this is a really cool figure as well, which I think helps. And that is the finished end result on the penitent. You can really see in the spinning around the contrast between those two shiny and matte elements. And that's it for painting metal surfaces. They're a fantastic way to add interesting texture and detail like rust, verdigris, or even scratches, and it makes your models come alive. In the next episode, we are going to be painting the Huntress, and the topic will be painting feathers. I am excited about this figure. I think it's one of the best sculpts in the whole range, and I'm looking forward to painting it. I'll see you in the next episode. Big Denno.